Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, checking the news, and finding out that the most powerful country on Earth has just completely vanished. I mean, it sounds like pure science fiction, right? But if we look back at historical reality, it tells a very different story. The citizens of ancient Rome, Imperial China, the Ottomans, the British Empire, they all genuinely believed their dominance was just a permanent fixture of the world. It was a given.
And yet, today, every single one of them is just gone. It's a stark, honestly kind of chilling reality when you really think about it, because despite their unmatched military might, all that vast wealth, and their absolute perceived invincibility, every single one of these historical titans ultimately fell. They went from ruling the world to just becoming chapters in a history textbook.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the anatomy of a collapse, and we're going to explore exactly why great empires fall. And here's the core thesis we'll be working with. These massive superpowers, they almost never die from just a single bad battle or one dramatic, explosive event. No, it's actually a deeply predictable historical pattern. It's a slow burn, not an explosion.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, we'll cover the illusion of forever. Then, we'll look at the internal rot, followed by shocks to the system. And finally, we'll wrap up with echoes in the present. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The illusion of forever. Internal versus external forces.
When we really zoom out and look across history, a pretty clear foundational formula for societal collapse starts to emerge. It basically boils down to this. On one side, you have internal weakness. Think decaying economies, chaotic politics, rising inequality. And on the other side, you've got external pressure. That's your rival powers testing borders, invasions, or just aggressive new competitors on the world stage. Collapse is essentially this perfect storm. It happens when decades of that quiet internal decay finally collide head-on with mounting external pressure.
Moving on to Section 2, the internal rot. The foundation cracks.
So within that internal decay we just talked about, there are really three sequential pillars that universally rot an empire's foundation from the inside out. We're looking at economic decline, political instability, and social unrest. And the best way to think about these is like a cascading chain reaction. Once the first domino falls, it almost inevitably triggers the next.
Let's start by looking at that first pillar, economic decline. Look, over time, a lot of empires simply fall into the trap of spending way more than they can sustain. They start pouring just unimaginable resources into endless border wars, ridiculously lavish palaces, and these massively bloated bureaucracies, until, eventually, their finances just crack. Ancient Rome is literally the textbook example here. To keep funding their endless military campaigns, they started debasing their own currency. They literally replaced the silver in their coins with cheap metals, and, well, you can guess what happened next. Runaway inflation. So whether it's massive debt, totally unequal land ownership, or just failing tax systems, economic decline is the thing that quietly bankrupts the core of the state.
Okay, so once the economy starts wobbling, that second pillar crumbles right on cue, politics. As the empire grows richer at the very top, the elites start fighting fiercely amongst themselves for power. Corruption just runs absolutely rampant, and suddenly rulers become dangerously short-lived. I mean, think about Rome's infamous Year of the Five Emperors. Civil war literally tore the government apart. At this stage, ruling factions become so obsessed with fighting each other that they actively block necessary reforms. Basically, they start treating the state as nothing more than a tool for their own personal enrichment, rather than, actually governing.
Which brings us directly to our third pillar, society. At this point, you see this incredibly stark divide emerge between the reality of the elites and the reality of everyday citizens. Wealth concentrates so heavily at the top that the elites are essentially insulated in their palaces, wielding outsized political influence. But meanwhile, what is the ordinary citizen dealing with? They're facing higher taxes, lost political representation, and just deep everyday struggles to survive. And this gap widens drastically, not just in terms of bank accounts, but in education, lifestyle, and basic power. This kind of extreme inequality absolutely destroys the social contract. It fuels riots, regional rebellions, and new revolutionary movements. Because honestly, when ordinary people realize the system only exists to serve the top 1%, their loyalty to the state completely evaporates.
Which leads us to Section 3, shocks to the system, the final dominoes.
So, here is the multi-million-dollar question. What actually happens when an empire, which is already totally hollowed out from the inside, is suddenly tested by a major outside threat? Well, the crucial takeaway here is that once an empire is weakened internally, external problems that used to be totally manageable suddenly become existential dangers. Rivals smell blood in the water and start relentlessly testing the borders. Back in Rome, frontier groups started pushing deep into fragile imperial lands, which, as we know, eventually toppled the Western Empire entirely. For other states, this shock manifests as sudden, crushing military defeats or forced concessions. Take Qing China, for instance, which was just devastated by unequal treaties forced upon them by rising European industrial powers. The outside threat doesn't necessarily cause the rot, it just violently exposes how far the empire has already fallen behind.
But on top of the usual politics and war, we have to consider the ultimate historical wildcards, Mother Nature and technological innovation. Because these are the two forces that can drastically tilt the entire balance of global power practically overnight. Take the immense toll of nature, for example. We're talking about severe droughts, consecutive crop failures, and totally devastating disease outbreaks. Think of the Antonine Plague in Rome, which wiped out literally millions of people. And the thing is, these events always seem to hit an empire exactly when it's already starving for resources. These environmental disasters lead to shrinking populations, and logically, a weaker population means you have fewer soldiers to defend your borders, fewer workers to produce your goods, and critically, collapsing tax revenues for the state. It is just a massive, devastating blow to a system that is already hanging by a thread.
And it's at the exact same time we have the technology factor. When a massive empire gets too comfortable and becomes rigid, say by failing to adopt new weapons, new industries, or better ways of organizing society, it makes itself incredibly vulnerable. Rival states that adapt faster will easily and quickly outclass the old center of power. From the outside looking in, a societal collapse often looks incredibly sudden, like they just lost one big war or suffered a swift revolution. But as we've seen, it is rarely just bad luck. It's almost always the inevitable result of a rigid, completely inflexible system violently colliding with a rapidly changing, technologically advancing world.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 4, Echoes in the Present, the Modern Mirror. Let's turn that historical lens onto our modern world.
There's a really famous concept, often attributed to Mark Twain, that says, history doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And it's so true. The deeper patterns of human civilization, the rise, the peak, the inevitable fall, they show up again and again and again. And keeping this in mind bridges the gap perfectly between ancient Rome, the vast British Empire, and the highly complex, interconnected global landscape that we are all living in today.
Now, obviously, today's powerful countries rarely go around officially calling themselves empires. But as researchers point out, the modern warning signs are honestly uncomfortably familiar. We're seeing rising inequality, intense political polarization, a deep, deep mistrust of our institutions, massive climate stress, and incredibly rapid technological disruption. If you've been following along with the explainer so far, you'll see that these modern issues map perfectly, practically point by point, to the historical indicators of instability that we just explored across ancient and early modern civilizations.
And researchers consistently argue that out of all these complex factors, extreme inequality, and to be clear, we aren't just talking about simple poverty, but rather extreme, yawning wealth gaps, is one of the most powerful forces that actively breaks societies from within. When a tiny, isolated elite captures the vast majority of the wealth and successfully bends the institutions to really only serve themselves, ordinary people eventually withdraw their consent. They just stop believing in the system entirely. And historically speaking, that is exactly the moment when the foundation truly begins to crack.
So, to bring this all together, what is the ultimate takeaway from our explainer today? Well, it's that empires do not have a fixed expiration date magically stamped on them. They collapse because their immense success breeds a very dangerous complacency. They collapse because unchecked inequality makes their social fabric incredibly brittle. And they collapse because the arrogant failure to adapt makes them fragile in a world that never stops changing. The deepest lesson we can pull from Rome, from the Ottomans, from the British is beautifully simple. Power that forgets its people eventually loses both the people and the power.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. History has clearly provided us with the blueprint. We know the signs, we've seen the symptoms. The real question is, which of these warnings will we choose to ignore? I really hope this structured look at history has sparked your curiosity today and maybe given you a slightly new lens to view our modern world through. If you appreciate efficient, focused explainers like this that really dive deep into history and the mechanics of our world, please make sure to subscribe.
And hey, let me know down in the comments what historical empire or insanely complex topic do you want me to decode and structure for you next. Thanks so much for learning with me